It started as an innocent dinner. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. When I first met Alex, he was just a friend of my husband's. They worked together at the same marketing firm. And I'd heard about him for years, before we ever actually met. My husband, Derek, would come home and talk about Alex's sense of humor, his ideas, and sometimes I thought with a twinge of envy, even about his adventurous lifestyle. Alex was in many ways everything Derek wasn't: spontaneous, outspoken, and single. He'd traveled all over the world, wasn't afraid to speak his mind, and had a way of drawing people to him. I admit, I was curious about him before I ever even saw his face. Then about a year ago, Derek invited Alex over for a small gathering at our house. I remember opening the door, and there he was, standing there with that disarming smile, a bottle of wine in hand, looking like he had just stepped out of a movie. Tall, dark hair, that kind of messy, intentionally careless look that so many men try to pull off and fail at. But he wore it perfectly. The whole evening, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. I was laughing more, the kind of laughter that surprised me, that had me touching my own lips as if they weren't mine. His eyes found mine across the room, a glint of mischief or knowing, though he looked away quickly enough. There was something, a spark I hadn't felt in years. After that night, I'd see him now and then, at work functions or dinners with Derek, but nothing more. I was respectful, careful, because I loved my husband. But the feeling stayed, that small flutter, like the beginning of a slow, dangerous burn I couldn't put out. It was silly, I told myself, a crush I needed to ignore. I focused on my marriage, my work, the life Derek and I had built together. But that ember wouldn't die. It wasn't until a few weeks ago that I found myself alone with Alex. Derek was supposed to join us for drinks after work, but he called last minute to say he was stuck finishing up a project. Alex and I had already arrived, seated in a cozy corner of a dimly lit bar, nursing our first glasses of wine. I should have left then, made some excuse and gone home. But I didn't. The conversation flowed too easily, like there was some unspoken understanding between us. I laughed more in that hour than I had in months. He was charming, attentive, and somehow, as the night went on, his hand found mine across the table. I remember looking at his fingers, the warmth of his hand covering mine, and I didn't pull away. It was like some part of me had been waiting for that touch, a touch I hadn't even known I missed. He leaned in close, and I could feel his breath against my cheek, his voice low as he whispered something. I don't even remember what it was now, but it sent shivers down my spine. In that moment, I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in so long, and I didn't want it to end. When we left the bar, the city was dark, quiet, and cold. My heart pounded as we walked down the street, side by side, our hands brushing every now and then. It felt like a dream, one that I knew I should wake up from, but didn't want to. We stopped at a street corner, and he looked at me, searching my face as if waiting for a signal. It was the look in his eyes, that intense magnetic pull, that did it. I leaned in just a fraction, and he closed the gap. His lips were warm and firm, tasting faintly of wine and something sweet, and the world seemed to vanish around us. The guilt should have flooded me then. I should have felt horrified, ashamed, and maybe a part of me did, but I drowned it out with the feeling of his hands on my waist, pulling me closer. That kiss felt like everything I'd been missing, everything I hadn't let myself admit I craved. And in that moment, all the walls I'd built around myself shattered. That night is still a blur of sensations. We ended up in his apartment, the rain tapping softly against the window as we tangled together, losing ourselves in each other. I remember the way his hands traced over me, every touch leaving a fire in its wake, his eyes dark and full of desire. It was intoxicating, a release, a flood of emotions that I hadn't let myself feel in years. I was lost in him, in the way he looked at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. But morning came, and with it reality. I woke up next to him, my heart pounding not with excitement, but with the weight of what I'd done. I stared at the ceiling, the sunlight creeping in, as the guilt and shame finally settled in. I thought of Derek, of the life we'd built, and a deep, painful ache filled my chest. I dressed quickly, quietly, and left before Alex woke up. Now, weeks later, I'm still carrying the weight of that night. Every time I look at Derek, I feel a pang of guilt so strong it's hard to breathe. He looks at me with the same love, the same trust, and I feel like I'm suffocating under the weight of my own betrayal. I want to tell him, confess, purge myself of this guilt, but I can't bear the thought of hurting him. And so, I carry this secret, a silent burden that gnaws at me every day. That night with Alex awakened something in me that I didn't even realize I had lost. But it also shattered something else, something I may never get back. Days turned into weeks, but that night haunted me, lurking just below the surface of every routine moment. Every time Derek kissed me goodbye before leaving for work, every lazy Sunday morning we spent together, I felt like I was watching it all from behind a thick glass wall, separated by the weight of what I'd done. I had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. And yet, no matter how deep the guilt ran, the memory of that night with Alex was still there. A quiet, thrilling memory that crept up at the most unexpected moments. One evening, about a month after it happened, Derek suggested inviting Alex over for dinner. My heart sank as he casually mentioned it over the dinner table, not noticing my reaction as he kept talking about how he hadn't seen Alex in a while, how it would be nice to catch up. I wanted to say no, to find some excuse to avoid seeing him, but Derek's face was so open, so trusting. He had no idea, no reason to suspect anything. Saying no, without a good reason, might have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer. So with a forced smile I agreed. "It'll be nice to catch up," I managed, though I could feel my stomach twist with anxiety. The evening arrived faster than I wanted it to. I set the table, preparing a meal while Derek chose the music, humming to himself in the living room, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. When the doorbell rang, I felt like my heart would leap out of my chest. I smoothed my dress, forced a calm expression, and opened the door. There he was, standing there just as he had the first time. But this time, everything felt different. Our eyes met, and I saw the flicker of recognition, a silent understanding that passed between us. He greeted Derek with an easy, relaxed smile, and I watched as he seamlessly slipped into conversation. But every time our eyes met, that spark, that same pull was there, and it took every ounce of strength I had to ignore it. Throughout dinner, Alex and Derek talked, laughing and reminiscing about work and stories from their younger days. And I played my role, smiling and joining in. But my mind was racing, my pulse quickening every time I caught Alex's gaze. It was maddening, trying to act normal when every cell in my body was hyper-aware of him, of the secret we shared. I felt like I was teetering on the edge, barely holding it together, afraid that one wrong move would give everything away. When dinner was over, Derek went to the kitchen to get more wine, leaving Alex and me alone in the living room. The silence stretched between us, thick and charged, as if neither of us dared to speak, to shatter the fragile illusion of normalcy. He looked at me, his gaze intense, and for a moment, I thought he might say something, anything to acknowledge what was happening between us. Instead, he simply reached for his drink, his fingers brushing mine as he took his glass. That touch, light as it was, sent a surge of heat through me, a reminder of everything I'd been trying to push down. The moment passed, and Derek returned, oblivious to the tension that filled the room. We continued the evening, but that small, fleeting moment was enough to shake me to the core. When Alex finally left, I felt both relieved and hollow, like a part of me had been taken with him. I'd thought seeing him again would bring closure, that I'd be able to look at him and feel nothing but regret. But it hadn't worked. If anything, it had made things worse. The weeks that followed were a strange mix of avoidance and longing. I wanted to bury myself in my marriage, to find a way to reconnect with Derek, and forget about Alex. But Derek and I had fallen into a comfortable rhythm over the years, a familiarity that, while comforting, also left something to be desired. Our conversations revolved around work, errands, and plans with friends. There was little passion, little spark, just the steady hum of a life that was safe and predictable. And then one day, Alex texted me. It was short, simple, just a message to see how I was doing. I knew I shouldn't respond, that I should delete it and move on, but I didn't. I replied, just a quick, harmless message. One message led to another, and soon we were texting every day, talking about everything and nothing, filling the quiet spaces in my life that I hadn't realized had been empty. Our conversations became the highlight of my day, a guilty pleasure that I couldn't resist. We'd talk about his travels, his plans, things that felt exciting, different from the routine of my everyday life. He made me feel seen in a way that I hadn't felt in years, and I found myself opening up to him, sharing parts of myself that I hadn't shared with anyone, not even Derek. It was inevitable, I suppose, that we'd see each other again. One afternoon, he asked if I wanted to meet for coffee. I knew it was a bad idea, that meeting him would only make things more complicated, but I couldn't help myself. I agreed, telling Derek I was going to run some errands. We met at a small, quiet cafe on the other side of town, far enough from home that I felt safe, like no one would recognize us. When I walked in, he was already there, sitting by the window, watching the world go by. He looked up as I approached, a smile spreading across his face, and for a moment, I forgot everything else. We sat down, ordered coffee, and fell into easy conversation, as if we were old friends catching up, rather than two people hiding a dangerous secret. After coffee, we took a walk, wandering through the city streets, talking about everything and nothing, just enjoying each other's company. As the sun began to set, he stopped, turning to me, his eyes serious. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice low, his gaze holding mine. The honesty, the intensity in his eyes left me speechless, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I should walk away, that this was my last chance to stop before things went too far. But I couldn't. I was drawn to him, to the way he made me feel, and in that moment, I let go of everything else. He took my hand, and together, we walked back to his apartment, every step a quiet surrender to the feelings we'd been holding back for so long. That night, the weight of the world melted away, leaving only the two of us, tangled together in a stolen moment of passion. It was reckless, dangerous, and I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't resist. With him, I felt alive, like I was seeing the world in color for the first time in years. In the weeks that followed, we continued to meet in secret, stolen moments that I cherished and dreaded in equal measure. Every time I was with him, I felt free, like I was finally living the life I'd always wanted. But every time I went home to Derek, the guilt gnawed at me, a painful reminder of the line I'd crossed. I wanted to tell him, to come clean, but the thought of hurting him, of destroying our life together, kept me silent. I tried to distance myself from Alex, to end things before it spiraled further out of control, but every time I tried, I found myself drawn back to him, like a moth to a flame. Now, as I sit here, watching Derek sleep beside me, the weight of my choices presses down on me, a constant reminder of the life I've betrayed. I don't know how long I can keep this up, how long I can live with this secret, this dual life that's tearing me apart. Part of me wants to end things with Alex, to rebuild my marriage and move on. But another part of me, a part that I barely recognize, can't let go, can't give up the thrill, the passion, the feeling of being truly alive. And so, I remain caught between two worlds, two lives, torn between the safety of my marriage and the thrill of my affair, trapped in a web of my own making. The days that followed felt like walking on a tightrope, balancing my two lives with a kind of recklessness I barely recognized in myself. At home, I went through the motions, slipping into the role of the devoted wife, cooking dinner with Derek, curling up on the couch for our usual movie nights, trying to hold on to the life we'd built together. But my mind was somewhere else entirely. Every quiet moment was filled with thoughts of Alex, of our secret meetings, the stolen glances, the brief touches that lingered in my memory long after I'd left him. I told myself I'd end it. I tried to convince myself that this fling, this affair, was a phase, something I could walk away from. But the pull toward Alex only seemed to grow stronger. I was no longer in control. It was like I was under a spell, trapped in a whirlwind of desire and guilt that I couldn't break free from. I craved the excitement, the rush, the escape from the ordinary, all the things that I hadn't even realized I was missing until he came into my life. One evening, Derek mentioned that he'd be going out of town for a business conference. He'd be gone for 4 days, leaving on Friday and returning late Monday night. He told me this over dinner, casually, with a smile, not realizing how his words sent a thrill of anticipation through me. I felt a twinge of shame, but the thought of a whole weekend free from the usual secrecy and restraint, a weekend where I could be with Alex without constantly looking over my shoulder, was intoxicating. As soon as Derek left, I felt a strange mix of liberation and nervousness. I cleaned the house, paced from room to room, unable to focus on anything, knowing that soon Alex would be here, in the very space I shared with my husband. It was a step I knew I should never take, but I couldn't stop myself. I texted him, asking if he'd come over that night, half hoping he'd say no, that he'd have something else going on. But he responded almost immediately, and by the excitement in his reply, I knew he felt the same way. That night, when Alex arrived, it felt surreal, like I was living in some alternate version of my life. As he stepped inside, a familiar electricity crackled between us. He looked around, taking in the surroundings, the photos of Derek and me on the walls, our life together displayed in every corner of the room. For a moment, I felt exposed, like he was peering into a part of me I'd tried to keep separate, but he didn't seem fazed. Instead, he simply pulled me close, wrapping his arms around me, and I let myself melt into him, letting the weight of the guilt and the fear slip away. We spent the weekend together, stealing every moment we could, sharing meals, talking late into the night, laughing about things that felt trivial, but somehow so significant. With him, I felt like a different person, like I could shed the expectations, the labels, and just be myself. But beneath the thrill, there was a tension, an underlying sense that this couldn't last. Every kiss, every touch felt like a countdown, as if we were racing against time, knowing that eventually, reality would catch up with us. On the last night of Derek's trip, as we lay together in bed, Alex asked me something I hadn't expected. Have you ever thought about leaving him? The question hit me like a jolt, bringing a painful clarity to the fog of our weekend together. I hadn't allowed myself to consider it, not seriously. The thought of leaving Derek, of dismantling the life we'd built, was a line I hadn't dared to cross in my mind. But now, with Alex's steady gaze on me, the question hung in the air, demanding an answer. I don't know. I whispered, my voice barely audible. He looked at me, his expression soft but intense. I don't want to keep hiding, sneaking around like this. I don't want to be your secret anymore. His words lingered in the silence, and I felt a painful mix of emotions. The thrill of his desire for me, the guilt over my betrayal of Derek, the fear of what a choice like that would mean. I realized that in some part of me I wanted both. I wanted the safety and stability of my marriage, the comfort of Derek's love, and at the same time, I craved the excitement, the passion, the newness that Alex brought into my life. But I knew deep down that I couldn't have it all, that eventually I would have to choose. Alex stayed with me that night, holding me close, his warmth a comfort even as my mind raced with conflicting thoughts. By the time dawn broke, he was gone, and I was left alone, the emptiness of the house pressing in on me as I faced the consequences of the weekend. I spent the day in a haze, cleaning up, removing every trace of Alex's presence, trying to erase the evidence of what I'd done before Derek returned. When Derek walked through the door late that night, he looked tired but happy, oblivious to the storm that had taken place in his absence. He hugged me, his familiar scent a painful reminder of the life I'd almost shattered. I forced a smile, forcing myself back into the role of the loving wife, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The weeks that followed were a blur. I tried to pull away from Alex, to distance myself before things spiraled even further out of control, but the connection between us was like a magnet, pulling us back together despite the consequences. We'd meet in secret, hiding in corners of the city where we thought no one would find us, sharing stolen moments that felt both exhilarating and destructive. And every time I looked at Derek, every time he kissed me goodnight or held me close, the guilt gnawed at me, a constant reminder of the life I was risking. Eventually, it became too much. I found myself unable to focus, unable to pretend, torn between the love I felt for Derek and the consuming passion I felt for Alex. I knew I couldn't keep living this double life, couldn't keep deceiving Derek and betraying the trust he'd placed in me. But the thought of losing Alex, of walking away from the person who made me feel truly alive, felt impossible. One evening, after another tense and conflicted day, I finally sat down with Derek, my heart pounding as I tried to find the words. I knew this moment would come, that eventually, the truth would come out, but I hadn't prepared for the pain in his eyes as I started to speak. The way his face fell as he realized what I was about to say. Derek, I need to tell you something. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek as I struggled to continue, the weight of my choices pressing down on me like a crushing force. In that moment, I saw everything I was about to lose. The life we'd built, the love we'd shared, the trust he'd placed in me. I wish I could say that things ended cleanly, that I found the courage to make a choice, to walk away from Alex and repair the life I'd broken. But life is rarely that simple. I don't know what the future holds, whether I'll find a way to rebuild the trust I've shattered, or if I'll be able to let go of the part of me that found freedom, passion, and escape in Alex's arms. All I know is that I'm left with the consequences of my choices, the painful realization that sometimes, in the pursuit of happiness, we lose sight of what truly matters. And now, all I can do is pick up the pieces, facing the future with a mix of hope and regret, knowing that I can never truly undo what I've done. In the days that followed, I watched Derek move through our home with a silence that felt like it was suffocating us both. After I'd told him the truth, he had sat there stunned, as if his whole world had just collapsed in front of him. There was no screaming, no dramatic argument. He hadn't even asked for details. Instead, he looked at me with an expression that was somehow worse than anger. It was devastation, betrayal, a quiet disbelief that someone he trusted so completely could hurt him like this. Our conversations turned sparse, reduced to the most basic exchanges about groceries, the mail, or the dog. Every once in a while, he'd look at me, as if searching for some version of me he recognized, but I could feel him pulling away, closing off. I felt like a stranger in my own home, haunted by the silence that had replaced our laughter, our comfort, the easy companionship we once shared. I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning each night, alone with the crushing weight of guilt and regret. Every time I closed my eyes, memories would come flooding back, moments with Derek that I'd taken for granted, his soft voice calling my name in the mornings, the warmth of his hand in mine. How had I been so reckless, so selfish, to risk losing everything we had for a fleeting thrill, for moments of passion that now felt empty in the light of everything I'd broken? Meanwhile, Alex still lingered on the edge of my thoughts, a ghost I couldn't quite exorcise. Part of me wanted to call him, to find comfort in his arms, to escape from the mess I'd made of my life. But I knew that seeing him again would only complicate things, deepen the rift between Derek and me, and cement the end of everything I had once held so dear. So instead, I withdrew from him as well, stopping myself from reaching out, from responding to his messages, letting the silence between us grow until it became clear that whatever we had was over. One day, Derek finally asked me to sit down. He looked weary, shadows under his eyes, his face drawn with exhaustion I hadn't seen before. "I need to know," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Was it worth it? I wanted to tell him it hadn't been, that nothing was worth the hurt I'd caused him, that if I could take it all back I would. But even as I sat there, facing him, words failed me, because the truth was, some part of me had felt more alive in those moments with Alex than I had in years. It was a painful, shameful realization, one that cut deeper than I could express. I don't know. I finally managed, my voice choked with tears. I don't know what I was looking for, Derek. I don't know why I did it. But it wasn't worth losing you. He looked at me, and for the first time in days, I thought I saw a glimmer of something other than heartbreak in his eyes. Maybe it was pity, maybe it was understanding, or maybe it was just a painful acceptance of the reality we were now facing. The days blurred together, filled with quiet moments of grief, attempts at conversation that felt stilted and forced. Derek and I moved like ghosts through the house, both trying, in our own ways, to mend something that felt irreparably broken. But the wound between us was deep, a fissure that cut through every interaction, every look, every whispered attempt at reconciliation. Then one night, I came home to find Derek sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty glass of wine in front of him. He looked up as I walked in, his gaze heavy with something I couldn't quite read. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice thick, as if he'd been going over these words in his mind for hours. "About us. About what we had and if we can find it again." I held my breath, afraid of what he might say, of the finality of whatever decision he'd reached. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," he admitted, his voice raw. "But I also don't know if I can just throw away everything we've been through, everything we've built." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment, hope flickered within me. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for us to rebuild, to find a way back to each other, even if it would never be the same. I reached out, my hand trembling, and he took it, a tentative connection that felt both fragile and grounding. We agreed to try therapy, to seek out some kind of help that could guide us through the wreckage of our marriage. Each session was like reopening a wound, facing the pain and betrayal head-on, peeling back the layers of resentment, confusion, and heartbreak that had festered between us. Derek had questions, so many painful questions that tore at the seams of my soul as I answered them. I could see the hurt in his eyes each time, the way he flinched at the honesty he demanded, and I hated myself more with every answer. But slowly, painfully, we began to rebuild. It was a delicate process, one step forward, two steps back. Some days, I'd catch him looking at me with a mixture of anger and sadness, and I'd wonder if we were only prolonging the inevitable. Other days, he'd reach for my hand without thinking, and I'd feel a spark of hope, a glimmer of what we used to be. One evening, as we sat on the porch, the sun setting in a warm wash of pink and gold, Derek looked at me and took a deep breath. "I don't know if I'll ever trust you the way I used to," he admitted, his voice quiet but steady. "But I want to believe we can make it work. I want to believe that we're worth fighting for." Tears pricked at my eyes as I nodded, too overcome to speak. I knew I didn't deserve his forgiveness, his willingness to even try to move forward, but I was grateful, more grateful than I'd ever been for anything in my life. Over time, the memories of Alex began to fade, lingering at the edges of my mind, but no longer consuming my thoughts. I stopped wondering about him, stopped replaying the thrill of our moments together, letting them slip away like a fading dream. What had once seemed so vital, so intoxicating, now felt like a distant echo, a choice that had brought more pain than I'd ever anticipated. There were nights when Derek would still turn away from me, a subtle reminder that trust is not something that can be repaired overnight. But there were also moments, quiet, tentative moments, where I'd feel a warmth, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. Each day was a choice, a decision to try, to forgive, to hold on to whatever thread of love remained between us. I knew that I'd never truly be able to undo the hurt I'd caused, that the scar of my betrayal would always be there, etched into the foundation of our marriage. But maybe scars could be reminders not only of pain, but also of resilience, of the strength it took to rebuild after everything had fallen apart. In the end, I realized that life wasn't about finding constant excitement or fulfilling every desire. It was about building something real, something lasting, with the person who had chosen to stand by me despite my flaws, despite my mistakes. And as I sat there with Derek, his hand in mine, I knew that I was finally ready to let go of the past, to stop looking for answers in the wrong places, and to find a way to move forward together. The months that followed were a slow, painstaking journey through uncertainty, an endless loop of trying to heal, trying to forget, and trying to believe in a future that was hard to see. Derek and I kept going to therapy, one session after another, unraveling layers of hurt that neither of us knew we'd been holding on to. Some days, we'd walk out feeling like we'd made progress, like there was a way through the wreckage if we just kept going. Other days, the sessions were brutal, leaving us silent and raw, exhausted by the weight of everything that had happened. We learned new ways of talking to each other, ways to listen without interrupting, without defensiveness. Derek started opening up about things he'd never talked about before. The insecurities he'd hidden, the silent doubts he'd carried that he'd never dared to voice. And in those vulnerable moments, I began to see him with new eyes, not as the man I'd hurt, but as a person in his own right, with struggles and fears I'd never truly understood. It was humbling and painful to realize just how much I hadn't seen, how much of him I'd taken for granted. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rhythm of our lives began to change. We spent more time together, not just as husband and wife, but as two people trying to rebuild something fragile and new. We'd go for walks in the evenings, the quiet between us no longer feeling quite so heavy, and sometimes he'd reach for my hand, a small gesture that felt monumental in its simplicity. The nights were harder. There were moments when he'd turn away from me in bed, lost in his own thoughts, and I'd lie awake, wondering if we were fooling ourselves, if some wounds were simply too deep to heal. But then there were other nights, too. Nights where we'd talk until dawn, sharing our thoughts, our fears, the truths we'd hidden from each other for so long. We rediscovered each other tentatively, like strangers meeting for the first time. And in those moments, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real, honest hope that maybe we could build something new from the ashes, that maybe this pain could be a foundation for something stronger. One evening, Derek suggested we go away for the weekend. It was his idea, a surprise he planned after one particularly emotional therapy session, where we'd both left feeling drained, like we were fighting a battle we weren't sure we could win. Maybe we need a change of scenery, he said, his voice soft but hopeful. I agreed, hesitant but grateful. And the following weekend, we packed our bags and drove to a small cabin a few hours out of town. The cabin was nestled in the woods, surrounded by towering trees and the sound of a nearby stream. It was simple, quiet, a world away from our daily lives. And as we unpacked, I felt a sense of calm settle over me, a feeling that maybe here, we could leave some of the pain behind. We spent the weekend exploring the trails, cooking meals together, talking about everything and nothing. For the first time in months, I saw Derek smile, a real genuine smile, and it filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in so long. One night, as we sat by the fireplace, the room bathed in a soft, warm glow, Derek reached out, taking my hand in his. His thumb traced gentle circles over my skin, a small, familiar gesture that felt like coming home. He looked at me, his eyes full of a sadness that still lingered, but with a softness I hadn't seen in a long time. I don't know if we'll ever go back to how things were, he began, his voice quiet. But maybe that's okay. Maybe this is a chance to start over, to build something different, something better. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over us. We both knew that the scars of the past would never fully disappear, that we'd carry them with us no matter how hard we tried to move forward. But maybe that didn't have to be a bad thing. Maybe, as Derek said, it was an opportunity, a chance to create something new, something that wasn't perfect but was real. Over the next few months, our lives slowly began to take shape again. A new shape, one that didn't look quite like what we'd had before, but felt like it was ours. We kept going to therapy, kept having the hard conversations, kept learning how to navigate this fragile, complicated thing we were building. And through it all, I realized that love isn't just about passion or excitement, or even the security of a shared life. It's about choosing each other, every day, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. Alex became a distant memory, a chapter in my life that felt surreal and almost unrecognizable. I stopped wondering about him, stopped replaying our moments together, stopped needing that thrill that had once felt so vital. The hole he'd left, the excitement and desire he'd awoken, had faded, replaced by something deeper, something more lasting. It wasn't the same rush of adrenaline, the same high, but it was real, grounded, and it felt like something I could hold on to. One night, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sun set, Derek wrapped his arm around me, pulling me close. For the first time in a long time, I felt safe, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The weight of the past was still there, but it didn't feel quite as heavy, didn't feel like it defined us. It was part of our story, yes, but it didn't have to be the end. And as the stars came out one by one, I realized that in a strange way, the pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak, all of it had brought us to this moment. We were no longer the same people we had once been, but maybe that was okay. Maybe the love we had now, this new imperfect love, was stronger for everything we'd been through. As I rested my head on Derek's shoulder, listening to the quiet sounds of the night. I knew that the road ahead would still be hard, that there would be days when the past would resurface, bringing with it the pain and regret that would never fully disappear. But I also knew that we'd face it together, that we'd keep choosing each other, one day at a time. In the end, maybe that's all love really is, a choice, a promise to stand by each other, to face the darkness and the light, to rebuild, to forgive, to find hope in the smallest of moments. And as we sat there, wrapped in each other's warmth, I felt a quiet, unbreakable certainty that whatever the future held, we'd find a way through it together. As the months slipped by, Derek and I became like travelers who had lost their way, but were learning to navigate a new path together, one step at a time. There was no easy map, no clear directions, just an unspoken promise to keep moving forward, even if the road was rocky and uncertain. Every morning was a choice, a conscious decision to stay, to forgive, to rebuild. Though I knew the past still haunted us both, we began to find a new rhythm, our lives now marked by small, intentional acts that rebuilt trust, one fragile thread at a time. Sometimes, we'd spend an evening cooking together, laughing over shared memories that now felt bittersweet, each of us careful not to step on the delicate bridge we were creating. Other times, we'd work side by side in the garden, planting flowers that in some way felt symbolic of what we were trying to cultivate between us. Something resilient, something that could withstand the seasons of hardship. But there were also days when Derek would pull away, a shadow crossing his face that I recognized all too well. I would catch him staring off, his brow furrowed, the flicker of a memory darkening his expression. I could feel the questions rising in him, the unspoken fears, and I'd find myself holding my breath, wondering if he'd finally ask, if he'd finally say the words that hung between us. Can I really trust you again? Some nights, when the silence became too heavy, he'd reach for my hand, and the warmth of his touch would soothe the ache in my chest, reassuring me that, despite the uncertainty, he was still here, still trying. Those moments of quiet closeness felt like gifts, small victories that reminded me of the love that had brought us together in the first place. We weren't the same, but we were beginning to find a new kind of closeness, one forged through hardship and resilience. Therapy continued, and over time, our sessions began to shift. We started talking about the future, about what we wanted to build, the kind of life we wanted to create together. Derek began sharing dreams he'd never voiced before, little wishes for things he wanted to do someday, like taking a trip to Italy, exploring new hobbies, learning to play guitar. As he opened up, I felt a renewed sense of admiration for him, a gratitude for the strength it took to move forward after everything we'd been through. And gradually, I found myself opening up too, sharing my own hopes and dreams, my fears and regrets, finally letting him see the parts of me that I'd kept hidden even before the affair. One evening, as we sat together on the back porch watching a quiet rain fall, Derek turned to me, his face softened with a look I hadn't seen in what felt like a lifetime. I feel like we're learning each other all over again, he said, his voice barely louder than a whisper, yet filled with a depth that made my heart ache. I nodded, swallowing the emotion that had been building in my throat. It feels like we're starting from scratch, but maybe that's not such a bad thing. He gave a small, thoughtful smile. Maybe it's what we needed. From that moment on, things began to change in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. We became gentler with each other, more patient. We learned to communicate openly, to express not just our frustrations, but also our gratitude, our affection. Derek surprised me with little gestures, a note left by my morning coffee, a quiet walk together after dinner, moments that showed me he was still willing to try, still willing to fight for what we had. And I began to do the same, finding small ways to show him that he mattered, that I saw him, that I was still here, committed to repairing what I'd broken. In time, our intimacy returned, hesitantly at first, each touch a fragile promise, each kiss a hesitant step forward. It was different now, no longer the comfortable routine we'd fallen into before, but something more meaningful, a connection rooted in vulnerability and forgiveness. I felt a kind of tenderness between us that I hadn't felt in years, a mutual understanding that our love, though scarred, was still worth protecting, still worth nurturing. One night, Months after the affair had ended, Derek looked at me with a steady, searching gaze, and I could feel the weight of his question even before he asked it. "Do you still think about him?" The words hung in the air, and I felt my chest tighten, a cold fear settling over me. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and looked back at him, knowing that this was a moment of truth, one that could either deepen the trust we were building or unravel it completely. "No," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't. Not anymore." It was the truth. The memory of Alex had faded, slipping into the background of my mind like a story from another life, something distant and irrelevant. What had once felt like a blazing fire had cooled into ashes, leaving behind only a reminder of what I'd almost lost. The thrill, the excitement, all of it had been fleeting, a temporary escape from the real issues that I should have faced with Derek instead of running away. Now, as I looked into Derek's eyes, I knew, with a certainty I hadn't felt before, that he was the one I wanted to be with, the one I was willing to fight for. Derek nodded, and I could see the relief in his eyes, the weight that lifted from his shoulders as he took in my words. For the first time in what felt like forever, we were on the same page, moving forward together, no longer haunted by the past. Life didn't magically become perfect after that, of course. There were still hard days, moments when doubts and insecurities crept in, when the shadow of betrayal lingered in the background. But each time we faced it together, choosing to believe in the new foundation we were building, one that was stronger and more resilient than what we'd had before. We learned to celebrate the small victories, the moments of laughter, the shared dreams that reminded us why we were still here, still choosing each other. Over time, we began to make new memories, filling the spaces that had once been haunted by regret with moments of joy, of love, of quiet companionship. We took that trip to Italy Derek had dreamed of, wandering through ancient streets, sharing meals under starlit skies, finding beauty in the world together. We returned home with a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet confidence that we could weather whatever storms came our way. Years later, as I look back on that chapter of our lives, I see it not as the end, but as a turning point, a reminder of the strength it takes to rebuild, to forgive, to choose love even in the face of pain. Our marriage isn't perfect, but it's real, it's honest, and it's ours, forged through hardship and held together by the resilience we found in each other. Derek and I have become partners in a way we never were before, not just sharing a life, but truly understanding each other, flaws and all. Our love is different now. No longer the naive romance of our early years, but something deeper, something earned. And as I sit beside him, watching him laugh at something silly, feeling his hand in mine, I know that this is where I belong. This is the life we've chosen, the love we've fought for, and I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.